Chapters 13 through 16 of Human Bondage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 13. 2 years passed, and Philip was nearly 12. He was in the first form, within 2 or 3 places of the top, and after Christmas, when several boys would be leaving for the senior school, he would be head boy. He had already quite a collection of prizes, worthless books on bad paper, but in gorgeous bindings decorated with the arms of the school. His position had freed him from bullying, and he was not unhappy. His fellows forgave him his success because of his deformity. After all, it's jolly easy for him to get prizes, they said. There's nothing he can do but swat. He had lost his early terror of Mr. Watson. He had grown used to the loud voice, and when the headmaster's heavy hand was laid on his shoulder, Philip discerned vaguely the intention of a caress. He had the good memory which is more useful for scholastic achievements than mental power, and he knew Mr. Watson expected him to leave the preparatory school with a scholarship. But he had grown very self-conscious. The new-born child does not realize that his body is more a part of himself than surrounding objects, and will play with his toes without any feeling that they belong to him more than the rattle by his side. And it is only by degrees, through pain, that he understands the fact of the body. And experiences of the same kind are necessary for the individual to become conscious of himself. But here there is the difference that, although everyone becomes equally conscious of his body as a separate and complete organism, everyone does not become equally conscious of himself as a complete and separate personality. The feeling of apartness from others comes to most with puberty, but it is not always developed to such a degree as to make the difference between the individual and his fellows noticeable to the individual. It is such as he, as little conscious of himself as the bee in a hive, who are the lucky in life, for they have the best chance of happiness. Their activities are shared by all, and their pleasures are only pleasures because they are enjoyed in common. You will see them on Whit Monday dancing on Hampstead Heath, shouting at a football match, or from club windows in Pall Mall cheering a royal procession. It is because of them that man has been called a social animal. Philip passed from the innocence of childhood to bitter consciousness of himself by the ridicule which his club foot had excited. The circumstances of his case were so peculiar that he could not apply to them the ready-made rules which acted well enough in ordinary affairs, and he was forced to think for himself. The many books he had read filled his mind with ideas which, because he only half understood them, gave more scope to his imagination. Beneath his painful shyness something was growing up within him, and obscurely he realized his personality. But at times it gave him odd surprises. He did things, he knew not why, and afterwards, when he thought of them, found himself all at sea. There was a boy named Luard between whom and Philip a friendship had arisen, and one day when they were playing together in the schoolroom, Luard began to perform some trick with an ebony penholder of Philip's. "Don't play the giddy ox," said Philip. "You'll only break it." "I shan't." But no sooner were the words out of the boy's mouth than the penholder snapped in two. Luard looked at Philip with dismay. "Oh, I say, I'm awfully sorry." The tears rolled down Philip's cheeks, but he did not answer. "I say, what's the matter?" said Luard with surprise. "I'll get you another one exactly the same." "It's not about the penholder I care," said Philip in a trembling voice. "Only it was given me by my mater just before she died." "I say, I'm awfully sorry, Carey." "It doesn't matter. It wasn't your fault." Philip took the 2 pieces of the penholder and looked at them. He tried to restrain his sobs. He felt utterly miserable. And yet he could not tell why, for he knew quite well that he had bought the penholder during his last holidays at Blackstable for 1 and 2d. He did not know in the least what had made him invent that pathetic story, but he was quite as unhappy as though it had been true. The pious atmosphere of the vicarage and the religious tone of the school had made Philip's conscience very sensitive. He absorbed insensibly the feeling about him that the tempter was ever on the watch to gain his immortal soul. And though he was not more truthful than most boys, he never told a lie without suffering from remorse. When he thought over this incident he was very much distressed, and made up his mind that he must go to Luard and tell him that the story was an invention. Though he dreaded humiliation more than anything in the world, he hugged himself for 2 or 3 days at the thought of the agonizing joy of humiliating himself to the glory of God. But he never got any further. He satisfied his conscience by the more comfortable method of expressing his repentance only to the Almighty. But he could not understand why he should have been so genuinely affected by the story he was making up. The tears that flowed down his grubby cheeks were real tears. Then by some accident of association there occurred to him that scene when Emma had told him of his mother's death, and though he could not speak for crying, he had insisted on going in to say good-bye to the Mrs. Watkins so that they might see his grief and pity him. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Then a wave of religiosity passed through the school. Bad language was no longer heard, and the little nastiness of small boys were looked upon with hostility. The bigger boys, like the lords temporal of the Middle Ages, used the strength of their arms to persuade those weaker than themselves to virtuous courses. Philip, his restless mind avid for new things, became very devout. He heard soon that it was possible to join a Bible League, and wrote to London for particulars. These consisted in a form to be filled up with the applicant's name, age, and school, a solemn declaration to be signed that he would read a set portion of Holy Scripture every night for a year, and a request for half-a-crown. This, it was explained, was demanded partly to prove the earnestness of the applicant's desire to become a member of the League, and partly to cover clerical expenses. Philip duly sent the papers and the money, and in return received a calendar worth about a penny, on which was set down the appointed passage to be read each day, and a sheet of paper on one side of which was a picture of the Good Shepherd and a lamb, and on the other, decoratively framed in red lines, a short prayer which had to be said before beginning to read. Every evening he undressed as quickly as possible in order to have time for his task before the gas was put out. He read industriously, as he read always, without criticism, stories of cruelty, deceit, ingratitude, dishonesty, and low cunning. Actions which would have excited his horror in the life about him, in the reading passed through his mind without comment, because they were committed under the direct inspiration of God. The method of the League was to alternate a book of the Old Testament with a book of the New, and one night Philip came across these words of Jesus Christ: "If ye have faith and doubt not, ye shall not only do this which is done to the fig tree, but also if ye shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, it shall be done. And all this, whatever ye shall ask in prayer, believing, ye shall receive." They made no particular impression upon him, but it happened that 2 or 3 days later, being Sunday, the canon in residence chose them for the text of his sermon. Even if Philip had wanted to hear this, it would have been impossible, for the boys of King's School sit in the choir, and the pulpit stands at the corner of the transept so that the teacher's back is almost turned to them. The distance also is so great that it needs a man with a fine voice and a knowledge of elocution to make himself heard in the choir, and accordingly to long usage the canons of Tercanbury are chosen for their learning rather than for any qualities which might be of use in a cathedral church. But the words of the text, perhaps because he had read them so short a while before, came clearly enough to Philip's ears, and they seemed on a sudden to have a personal application. He thought about them through most of the sermon, and that night, on getting into bed, he turned over the pages of the Gospel and found once more the passage. Though he believed implicitly everything he saw in print, he had learned already that in the Bible things that said one thing quite clearly often mysteriously meant another. There was no one he liked to ask at school, so he kept the question he had in mind till the Christmas holidays, and then one day he made an opportunity. It was after supper and prayers were just finished. Mrs. Carey was counting the eggs that Mary Ann had brought in as usual, and writing on each one the date. Philip stood at the table and pretended to turn listlessly the pages of the Bible. "I say, Uncle William, this passage here, does it really mean that?" He put his finger against it as though he had come across it accidentally. Mr. Carey looked up over his spectacles. He was holding the Blackstable Times in front of the fire. It had come in that evening damp from the press, and the vicar always aired it for 10 minutes before he began to read. "What passage is that?" he asked. "Why, this about if you have faith you can remove mountains." "If it says so in the Bible, it is so, Philip," said Mrs. Carey gently, taking up the plate basket. Philip looked at his uncle for an answer. "It's a matter of faith." "Do you mean to say that if you really believed you could move mountains, you could?" "By the grace of God," said the vicar. "Now say good night to your uncle, Philip," said Aunt Louisa. "You're not wanting to move a mountain tonight, are you?" Philip allowed himself to be kissed on the forehead by his uncle and preceded Mrs. Carey upstairs. He had got the information he wanted. His little room was icy, and he shivered when he put on his nightshirt. But he always felt that his prayers were more pleasing to God when he said them under conditions of discomfort. The coldness of his hands and feet were an offering to the Almighty, and tonight he sank on his knees, buried his face in his hands, and prayed to God with all his might that he would make his clubfoot whole. It was a very small thing beside the moving of mountains. He knew that God could do it if he wished, and his own faith was complete. Next morning, finishing his prayers with the same request, he fixed a date for the miracle. "O God, in thy loving mercy and goodness, if it be thy will, please make my foot all right on the night before I go back to school." He was glad to get his petition into a formula, and he repeated it later in the dining room during the short pause which the vicar always made after prayers before he rose from his knees. He said it again in the evening and again, shivering in his nightshirt before he got into bed. And he believed. For once he looked forward with eagerness to the end of the holidays. He laughed to himself as he thought of his uncle's astonishment when he ran down the stairs 3 at a time, and after breakfast he and Aunt Louisa would have to hurry out and buy a new pair of boots. At school they would be astounded. "Hello, Carey, what have you done with your foot?" "Oh, it's all right now," he would answer casually, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He would be able to play football. His heart leaped as he saw himself running faster than any of the other boys. At the end of the Easter term there were the sports, and he would be able to go in for the races. He rather fancied himself over the hurdles. It would be splendid to be like everyone else, not to be stared at curiously by new boys who did not know about his deformity, nor at the baths in summer to need incredible precautions while he was undressing before he could hide his foot in the water. He prayed with all the power of his soul. No doubts assailed him. He was confident in the word of God. And the night before he was to go back to school, he went up to bed tremulous with excitement. There was snow on the ground, and Aunt Louisa had allowed herself the unaccustomed luxury of a fire in her bedroom. But in Philip's little room it was so cold that his fingers were numb, and he had great difficulty in undoing his collar. His teeth chattered. The idea came to him that he must do something more than usual to attract the attention of God, and he turned back the rug which was in front of his bed so that he could kneel on the bare boards. And then it struck him that his nightshirt was a softness that might displease his Maker, so he took it off and said his prayers naked. When he got into bed he was so cold that for some time he could not sleep, but when he did, it was so soundly that Mary Ann had to shake him when she brought in his hot water next morning. She talked to him while she drew the curtains, but he did not answer. He had remembered at once that this was the morning for the miracle. His heart was filled with joy and gratitude. His first instinct was to put down his hand and feel the foot which was whole now, but to do this seemed to doubt the goodness of God. He knew that his foot was well, but at last he made up his mind, and with the toes of his right foot he just touched his left. Then he passed his hand over it. He limped downstairs just as Mary Ann was going into the dining room for prayers, and then sat down to breakfast. "You're very quiet this morning, Philip," said Aunt Louisa presently. "He's thinking of the good breakfast he'll have at school tomorrow," said the vicar. When Philip answered, it was in a way that always irritated his uncle, with something that had nothing to do with the matter in hand. He called it a bad habit of wool gathering. "Supposing you'd asked God to do something," said Philip, "and really believed it was going to happen, like moving a mountain, I mean, and you had faith, and it didn't happen. What would it mean?" "What a funny boy you are," said Aunt Louisa. "You asked about moving mountains 2 or 3 weeks ago." "It would just mean that you hadn't got faith," answered Uncle William. Philip accepted the explanation. If God had not cured him, it was because he did not really believe. And yet he did not see how he could believe more than he did. But perhaps he had not given God enough time. He had only asked him for 19 days. In a day or two he began his prayer again, and this time he fixed upon Easter. That was the time of his son's glorious resurrection, and God in his happiness might be mercifully inclined. But now Philip added other means of attaining his desire. He began to wish when he saw a new moon or a dappled horse, and he looked out for shooting stars. During Exeat they had a chicken at the vicarage, and he broke the lucky bone with Aunt Louisa and wished again, each time that his foot might be made whole. He was appealing unconsciously to gods older to his race than the God of Israel, and he bombarded the Almighty with his prayer, at odd times of the day, whenever it occurred to him, in identical words always, for it seemed to him important to make his request in the same terms. But presently the feeling came to him that this time also his faith would not be great enough. He could not resist the doubt that assailed him. He made his own experience into a general rule. "I suppose no one ever has faith enough," he said. It was like the salt which his nurse used to tell him about. You could catch any bird by putting salt on his tail, and once he had taken a little bag of it into Kensington Gardens. But he could never get near enough to put the salt on a bird's tail. Before Easter he had given up the struggle. He felt a dull resentment against his uncle for taking him in. The text which spoke of the moving of mountains was just one of those that said one thing and meant another. He thought his uncle had been playing a practical joke on him. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. The King's School at Tercanbury, to which Philip went when he was 13, prided itself on its antiquity. It traced its origin to an abbey school, founded before the Conquest, where the rudiments of learning were taught by Augustine monks. And like many another establishment of this sort, on the destruction of the monasteries, it had been reorganized by the officers of King Henry VIII, and thus acquired its name. Since then, pursuing its modest course, it had given to the sons of the local gentry and of the professional people of Kent an education sufficient to their needs. 1 or 2 men of letters, beginning with a poet, than whom only Shakespeare had a more splendid genius, and ending with a writer of prose whose view of life had affected profoundly the generation of which Philip was a member, had gone forth from its gates to achieve fame. It had produced 1 or 2 eminent lawyers, but eminent lawyers are common, and 1 or 2 soldiers of distinction. But during the 3 centuries since its separation from the monastic order, it had trained especially men of the church, bishops, deans, canons, and above all, country clergymen. There were boys in the school whose fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers had been educated there, and had all been rectors of parishes in the diocese of Tercanbury, and they came to it with their minds made up already to be ordained. But there were signs notwithstanding that even there changes were coming. For a few, repeating what they had heard at home, said that the church was no longer what it used to be. It wasn't so much the money, but the class of people who went in for it weren't the same, and 2 or 3 boys knew curates whose fathers were tradesmen. They'd rather go out to the colonies. In those days the colonies were still the last hope of those who could get nothing to do in England, than be a curate under some chap who wasn't a gentleman. At King's School, as at Blackstable Vicarage, a tradesman was anyone who was not lucky enough to own land. And here a fine distinction was made between the gentleman farmer and the landowner, or did not follow one of the 4 professions to which it was possible for a gentleman to belong. Among the day boys, of whom there were about 150, sons of the local gentry and of the men stationed at the depot, those whose fathers were engaged in business were made to feel the degradation of their state. The masters had no patience with modern ideas of education, which they read of sometimes in the Times or the Guardian, and hoped fervently that King's School would remain true to its old traditions. The dead languages were taught with such thoroughness that an old boy seldom thought of Homer or Virgil in after life without a qualm of boredom. And though in the common room at dinner 1 or 2 bolder spirits suggested that mathematics were of increasing importance, the general feeling was that they were a less noble study than the classics. Neither German nor chemistry was taught, and French only by the form masters. They could keep order better than a foreigner, and since they knew the grammar as well as any Frenchman, it seemed unimportant that none of them could have got a cup of coffee in the restaurant at Boulogne unless the waiter had known a little English. Geography was taught chiefly by making boys draw maps, and this was a favorite occupation, especially when the country dealt with was mountainous. It was possible to waste a great deal of time in drawing the Andes or the Apennines. The masters, graduates of Oxford or Cambridge, were ordained and unmarried. If by chance they wished to marry, they could only do so by accepting one of the smaller livings at the disposal of the chapter. But for many years none of them had cared to leave the refined society of Tercanbury, which, owing to the cavalry depot, had a martial as well as an ecclesiastical tone for the monotony of life in a country rectory. And they were now all men of middle age. The headmaster, on the other hand, was obliged to be married, and he conducted the school till age began to tell upon him. When he retired, he was rewarded with a much better living than any of the undermasters could hope for, and an honorary canonry. But a year before Philip entered the school, a great change had come over it. It had been obvious for some time that Dr. Fleming, who had been headmaster for the quarter of a century, was become too deaf to continue his work to the greater glory of God. And when one of the livings on the outskirts of the city fell vacant, with a stipend of 600 a year, the chapter offered it to him in such a manner as to imply that they thought it high time for him to retire. He could nurse his ailments comfortably on such an income. 2 or 3 curates who had hoped for preferment told their wives it was scandalous to give a parish that needed a young, strong, and energetic man to an old fellow who knew nothing of parochial work, and had feathered his nest already. But the mutterings of the unbeneficed clergy do not reach the ears of a cathedral chapter. And as for the parishioners, they had nothing to say in the matter, and therefore nobody asked for their opinion. The Wesleyans and the Baptists both had chapels in the village. When Dr. Fleming was thus disposed of, it became necessary to find a successor. It was contrary to the traditions of the school that one of the lower masters should be chosen. The common room was unanimous in desiring the election of Mr. Watson, headmaster of the preparatory school. He could hardly be described as already a master of King's School. They had all known him for 20 years, and there was no danger that he would make a nuisance of himself. But the chapter sprang a surprise on them. It chose a man called Perkins. At first nobody knew who Perkins was, and the name favorably impressed no one. But before the shock of it had passed away, it was realized that Perkins was the son of Perkins the linen-draper. Dr. Fleming informed the masters just before dinner, and his manner showed his consternation. Such of them as were dining in ate their meal almost in silence, and no reference was made to the matter till the servants had left the room. Then they set to. The names of those present on this occasion are unimportant, but they had been known to generations of schoolboys as Size, Tar, Winks, Squirts, and Pat. They all knew Tom Perkins. The first thing about him was that he was not a gentleman. They remembered him quite well. He was a small, dark boy with untidy black hair and large eyes. He looked like a gypsy. He had come to the school as a day boy, with the best scholarship on their endowment, so that his education had cost him nothing. Of course he was brilliant. At every speech day he was loaded with prizes. He was their show boy, and they remembered now bitterly their fear that he would try to get some scholarship at one of the larger public schools, and so pass out of their hands. Dr. Fleming had gone to the linen draper, his father, they all remembered the shop, Perkins and Cooper, in St. Catherine Street, and said he hoped Tom would remain with them till he went to Oxford. The school was Perkins and Cooper's best customer, and Mr. Perkins was only too glad to give the required assurance. Tom Perkins continued to triumph. He was the finest classical scholar that Dr. Fleming remembered, and on leaving the school took with him the most valuable scholarship they had to offer. He got another at Magdalen and settled down to a brilliant career at the university. The school magazine recorded the distinctions he achieved year after year, and when he got his double first, Dr. Fleming himself wrote a few words of eulogy on the front page. It was with greater satisfaction that they welcomed his success, since Perkins and Cooper had fallen upon evil days. Cooper drank like a fish, and just before Tom Perkins took his degree, the linen drapers filed their petition in bankruptcy. In due course Tom Perkins took holy orders and entered upon the profession for which he was so admirably suited. He had been an assistant master at Wellington and then at Rugby. But there was quite a difference between welcoming his success at other schools and serving under his leadership in their own. Tar had frequently given him lines, and Squirts had boxed his ears. They could not imagine how the chapter had made such a mistake. No one could be expected to forget that he was the son of a bankrupt linen draper, and the alcoholism of Cooper seemed to increase the disgrace. It was understood that the dean had supported his candidature with zeal, so the dean would probably ask him to dinner. But would the pleasant little diners in the precincts ever be the same when Tom Perkins sat at the table? And what about the depot? He really could not expect officers and gentlemen to receive him as one of themselves. It would do the school incalculable harm. Parents would be dissatisfied, and no one could be surprised if there were wholesale withdrawals. And then the indignity of calling him Mr. Perkins. The masters thought by way of protest of sending in their resignations in a body, but the uneasy fear that they would be accepted with equanimity restrained them. "The only thing is to prepare ourselves for changes," said Size, who had conducted the fifth form for 25 years with unparalleled incompetence. And when they saw him, they were not reassured. Dr. Fleming invited them to meet him at luncheon. He was now a man of 32, tall and lean, but with the same wild and unkempt look they remembered on him as a boy. His clothes, ill-made and shabby, were put on untidily. His hair was as black and as long as ever, and he had plainly never learned to brush it. It fell over his forehead with every gesture, and he had a quick movement of the hand with which he pushed it back from his eyes. He had a black moustache and a beard which came high up on his face almost to the cheekbones. He talked to the masters quite easily, as though he had parted from them a week or two before. He was evidently delighted to see them. He seemed unconscious of the strangeness of the position, and appeared not to notice any oddness in being addressed as Mr. Perkins. When he bade them good-bye, one of the masters, for something to say, remarked that he was allowing himself plenty of time to catch his train. "I want to go round and have a look at the shop," he answered cheerily. There was a distinct embarrassment. They wondered that he could be so tactless, and to make it worse, Dr. Fleming had not heard what he said. His wife shouted it in his ear. He wants to go round and look at his father's old shop." Only Tom Perkins was unconscious of the humiliation which the whole party felt. He turned to Mrs. Fleming. "Who's got it now, d'you know?" She could hardly answer. She was very angry. "It's still a linen-draper's," she said bitterly. "Grove is the name. We don't deal there any more." "I wonder if he'd let me go over the house." "I expect he would if you explain who you are." It was not till the end of dinner that evening that any reference was made in the common room to the subject that was all in their minds. Then it was Sighs who asked, "Well, what did you think of our new head?" They thought of the conversation at luncheon. It was hardly a conversation, it was a monologue. Perkins had talked incessantly. He talked very quickly, with a flow of easy words and in a deep, resonant voice. He had a short, odd little laugh which showed his white teeth. They had followed him with difficulty, for his mind darted from subject to subject with a connection they did not always catch. He talked of pedagogics, and this was natural enough, but he had much to say of modern theories in Germany which they had never heard of and received with misgiving. He talked of the classics, but he had been to Greece, and he discoursed of archaeology. He had once spent a winter digging. They could not see how that helped a man to teach boys to pass examination. He talked of politics. It sounded odd to them to hear him compare Lord Beaconsfield with Alcibiades. He talked of Mr. Gladstone and Home Rule. They realized that he was a Liberal. Their hearts sank. He talked of German philosophy and of French fiction. They could not think a man profound whose interests were so diverse. It was Winks who summed up the general impression and put it into a form they all felt conclusively damning. Winks was the master of the upper third, a weak-kneed man with drooping eyelids. He was too tall for his strength, and his movements were slow and languid. He gave an impression of lassitude, and his nickname was eminently appropriate. "He's very enthusiastic," said Winks. Enthusiasm was ill-bred. Enthusiasm was ungentlemanly. They thought of the Salvation Army with its braying trumpets and its drums. Enthusiasm meant change. They had goose-flesh when they thought of all the pleasant old habits which stood in imminent danger. They hardly dared to look forward to the future. "He looks more of a gypsy than ever," said one after a pause. "I wonder if the dean and chapter knew that he was a radical when they elected him," another observed bitterly. But conversation halted. They were too much disturbed for words. When Tar and Sighs were walking together to the chapter house on Speech Day a week later, Tar, who had a bitter tongue, remarked to his colleague, "Well, we've seen a good many Speech Days here, haven't we? I wonder if we shall see another." Sighs was more melancholy even than usual. "If anything worth having comes along in the way of a living, I don't mind when I retire." Chapter 16. A year passed, and when Philip came to the school the old masters were all in their places, but a good many changes had taken place notwithstanding their stubborn resistance, none the less formidable because it was concealed under an apparent desire to fall in with the new head's ideas. Though the form masters still taught French to the lower school, another master had come, with a degree of doctor in philosophy from the University of Heidelberg, and a record of 3 years spent in a French lycée, to teach French to the upper forms and German to anyone who cared to take it up, instead of Greek. Another master was engaged to teach mathematics more systematically than had been found necessary hitherto. Neither of these was ordained. This was a real revolution, and when the pair arrived the older masters received them with distrust. A laboratory had been fitted up, army classes were instituted. They all said the character of the school was changing. And heaven only knew what further projects Mr. Perkins turned in that untidy head of his. The school was small as public schools go. There were not more than 200 boarders, and it was difficult for it to grow larger, for it was huddled up against the cathedral. The precincts, with the exception of a house in which some of the masters lodged, were occupied by the cathedral clergy, and there was no more room for building. But Mr. Perkins devised an elaborate scheme by which he might obtain sufficient space to make the school double its present size. He wanted to attract boys from London. He thought it would be good for them to be thrown in contact with the Kentish lads, and it would sharpen the country wits of these. "It's against all our traditions," said Sighs, when Mr. Perkins made the suggestion to him. "We've rather gone out of our way to avoid the contamination of boys from London." "Oh, what nonsense!" said Mr. Perkins. No one had ever told the form master before that he talked nonsense, and he was meditating an acid reply in which perhaps he might insert a veiled reference to hosiery, when Mr. Perkins, in his impetuous way, attacked him outrageously. "That house in the precincts. If you'd only marry I'd get the chapter to put another couple of stories on, and we'd make dormitories and studies, and your wife could help you." The elderly clergyman gasped. Why should he marry? He was 57. A man couldn't marry at 57. He couldn't start looking after a house at his time of life. He didn't want to marry. If the choice lay between that and the country living he would much sooner resign. All he wanted now was peace and quietness. "I'm not thinking of marrying," he said. Mr. Perkins looked at him with his dark bright eyes, and if there was a twinkle in them, poor Sighs never saw it. "What a pity! Couldn't you marry to oblige me? It would help me a great deal with the dean and chapter when I suggest rebuilding your house." But Mr. Perkins' most unpopular innovation was his system of taking occasionally another man's form. He asked it as a favor, but after all it was a favor which could not be refused, and as Tar, otherwise Mr. Turner, said, it was undignified for all parties. He gave no warning, but after morning prayers would say to one of the masters, "I wonder if you'd mind taking the sixth to-day at 11. We'll change over, shall we?" They did not know whether this was usual at other schools, but certainly it had never been done at Tercanbury. The results were curious. Mr. Turner, who was the first victim, broke the news to his form that the headmaster would take them for Latin that day, and on that pretense that they might like to ask a question or two so that they should not make perfect fools of themselves, spent the last quarter of an hour of the history lesson in construing for them the passage of Livy which had been set for the day. But when he rejoined his class and looked at the paper on which Mr. Perkins had written the marks, a surprise awaited him. For the two boys at the top of the form seemed to have done very ill, while others who had never distinguished themselves before were given full marks. When he asked Eldridge, his cleverest boy, what was the meaning of this, the answer came sullenly. "Mr. Perkins never gave us any construing to do. He asked me what I knew about General Gordon." Mr. Turner looked at him in astonishment. The boys evidently felt they had been hardly used, and he could not help agreeing with their silent dissatisfaction. He could not see either what General Gordon had to do with Livy. He hazarded an inquiry afterwards. "Eldridge was dreadfully put out because you asked him what he knew about General Gordon," he said to the headmaster with an attempt at a chuckle. Mr. Perkins laughed. "I saw that they got to the agrarian laws of Caius Gracchus, and I wondered if they knew anything about the agrarian troubles in Ireland. But all they knew about Ireland was that Dublin was on the Liffey. So I wondered if they'd ever heard of General Gordon." Then the horrid fact was disclosed that the new head had a mania for general information. He had doubts about the utility of examinations on subjects which had been crammed for the occasion. He wanted common sense. Sighs grew more worried every month. He could not get the thought out of his head that Mr. Perkins would ask him to fix a day for his marriage, and he hated the attitude the head adopted towards classical literature. There was no doubt that he was a fine scholar, and he was engaged on a work which was quite in the right tradition. He was writing a treatise on the trees in Latin literature, but he talked of it flippantly, as though it were a pastime of no great importance, like billiards, which engaged his leisure but was not to be considered with seriousness. And Squirts, the master of the middle third, grew more ill-tempered every day. It was in his form that Philip was put on entering the school. The Reverend B. B. Gordon was a man by nature ill-suited to be a schoolmaster. He was impatient and choleric. With no one to call him to account, with only small boys to face him, he had long lost all power of self-control. He began his work in a rage and ended it in a passion. He was a man of middle height and of a corpulent figure. He had sandy hair, worn very short and now growing gray, and a small, bristly moustache. His large face, with indistinct features and small blue eyes, was naturally red, but during his frequent attacks of anger it grew dark and purple. His nails were bitten to the quick, for while some trembling boy was construing, he would sit at his desk shaking with the fury that consumed him and gnaw his fingers. Stories, perhaps exaggerated, were told of his violence, and 2 years before there had been some excitement in the school when it was heard that one father was threatening a prosecution. He had boxed the ears of a boy named Walters with a book so violently that his hearing was affected, and the boy had to be taken away from the school. The boy's father lived in Tercanbury, and there had been much indignation in the city. The local paper had referred to the matter. But Mr. Walters was only a brewer, so the sympathy was divided. The rest of the boys, for reasons best known to themselves, though they loathed the master, took his side in the affair, and to show their indignation that the school's business had been dealt with outside, made things as uncomfortable as they could for Walter's younger brother, who still remained. But Mr. Gordon had only escaped the country living by the skin of his teeth, and he had never hit a boy since. The right the masters possessed to cane boys on the hand was taken away from them, and Squirts could no longer emphasize his anger by beating his desk with the cane. He never did more now than take a boy by the shoulders and shake him. He still made a naughty or refractory lad stand with one arm stretched out for anything from 10 minutes to half an hour, and he was as violent as before with his tongue. No master could have been more unfitted to teach things to so shy a boy as Philip. He had come to the school with fewer terrors than he had when first he went to Mr. Watson's. He knew a good many boys who had been with him at the preparatory school. He felt more grown up, and instinctively realized that among the larger numbers his deformity would be less noticeable. But from the first day Mr. Gordon struck terror in his heart, and the master, quick to discern the boys who were frightened of him, seemed on that account to take a peculiar dislike to him. Philip had enjoyed his work, but now he began to look upon the hours passed in school with horror. Better than risk an answer which might be wrong and excite a storm of abuse from the master, he would sit stupidly silent, and when it came towards his turn to stand up and construe, he grew sick and white with apprehension. His happy moments were those when Mr. Perkins took the form. He was able to gratify the passion for general knowledge which beset the headmaster. He had read all sorts of strange books beyond his years, and often Mr. Perkins, when a question was going round the room, would stop at Philip with a smile that filled the boy with rapture and say, "Now, Carey, you tell them." The good marks he got on these occasions increased Mr. Gordon's indignation. One day it came to Philip's turn to translate, and the master sat there glaring at him and furiously biting his thumb. He was in a ferocious mood. Philip began to speak in a low voice. "Don't mumble," shouted the master. Something seemed to stick in Philip's throat. "Go on, go on, go on." Each time the words were screamed more loudly. The effect was to drive all he knew out of Philip's head, and he looked at the printed page vacantly. Mr. Gordon began to breathe heavily. "If you don't know, why don't you say so? Do you know it or not? Did you hear all this construed last time or not? Why don't you speak? Speak, you blockhead, speak!" The master seized the arms of his chair and grasped them as though to prevent himself from falling upon Philip. They knew that in past days he often used to seize boys by the throat till they almost choked. The veins in his forehead stood out, and his face grew dark and threatening. He was a man insane. Philip had known the passage perfectly the day before, but now he could remember nothing. "I don't know it," he gasped. "Why don't you know it? Let's take the words one by one. We'll soon see if you don't know it." Philip stood silent, very white, trembling a little, with his head bent down on the book. The master's breathing grew almost stertorous. "The headmaster says you're clever. I don't know how he sees it. General information." He laughed savagely. "I don't know what they put you in his form for, blockhead." He was pleased with the word, and he repeated it at the top of his voice. "Blockhead, blockhead, club-footed blockhead." That relieved him a little. He saw Philip redden suddenly. He told him to fetch the black book. Philip put down his Caesar and went silently out. The black book was a sombre volume in which the names of boys were written with their misdeeds, and when a name was put down 3 times it meant a caning. Philip went to the headmaster's house and knocked at his study door. Mr. Perkins was seated at his table. "May I have the black book, please, sir?" "There it is," answered Mr. Perkins, indicating its place by a nod of his head. "What have you been doing that you shouldn't?" "I don't know, sir." Mr. Perkins gave him a quick look, but without answering went on with his work. Philip took the book and went out. When the hour was up, a few minutes later, he brought it back. "Let me have a look at it," said the headmaster. "I see Mr. Gordon has black-booked you for gross impertinence. What was it?" "I don't know, sir. Mr. Gordon said I was a club-footed blockhead." Mr. Perkins looked at him again. He wondered whether there was sarcasm behind the boy's reply, but he was still much too shaken. His face was white and his eyes had a look of terrified distress. Mr. Perkins got up and put the book down. As he did so, he took up some photographs. "A friend of mine sent me some pictures of Athens this morning," he said casually. "Look here, there's the Acropolis." He began explaining to Philip what he saw. The ruin grew vivid with his words. He showed him the theatre of Dionysus and explained in what order the people sat, and how beyond they could see the blue Aegean. And then suddenly he said, "I remember Mr. Gordon used to call me a gypsy counter-jumper when I was in his form." And before Philip, his mind fixed on the photographs, had time to gather the meaning of the remark, Mr. Perkins was showing him a picture of Salamis, and with his finger, a finger of which the nail had a little black edge to it, was pointing out how the Greek ships were placed and how the Persian. End of chapter 16. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.